Hi ladies, it's lovely to be back with you and looking at the book of Esther together, and I hope that it will be a great encouragement to you as we go through this overview of the book of Esther together. I want to just start off the study by quoting Charles Swindoll, who says God's presence is not as intriguing as his absence. His voice is not as eloquent as his silence. Who of us has not longed for a word from God, searched for a glimpse of his power, or yearned for the reassurance of his presence, only to feel that he seems absent from the moment, distant, preoccupied, maybe even unconcerned. And yet, later we realize how very present he was all along. As we go through this book of Esther over the next few studies, you will notice that there is no mention of God in the book, and yet he is present in every scene and in the movement of every event. And so I hope what will comfort you as we work our way through this book is a reminder to us that God sees the events of life ahead of time. Something, of course, none of us can actually do. We've no clue what will happen 1 minute from now. We've got no idea what will happen next. But our invisible God is continually, constantly, and confidently at work. So let's have a look. Who is this book of Esther all about? Well, it's about 5 people. 6 actually, but let's look at the first 5. So first of all, it's about a king called Xerxes. So if you look in Esther chapter 1, verse 1 to 2, we're told that he is a very powerful king. There was no more powerful man on earth at that time than the Persian king Xerxes. And then in chapter 1, verse 9, we meet a queen called Vashti. She was a strong-minded, independent-thinking woman who was not afraid to go against the wishes of her husband, the king. Then in chapter 3, verse 1, there is wicked Haman. He was a wealthy and influential officer in the court of the king. Mordecai the Jew is introduced to us in chapter 2, verse 5 to 6. And lastly, there is Esther. Esther is her Persian name, meaning star, and she really is the star of the show. Chapter 1, verse 7 tells us a little bit about Esther. We're told, chapter 2, verse 7, my bad. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah. Hadassah was her Jewish name, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This girl, who was also known as Esther, was lovely in form and features, and Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother had died. So what is the story that we find in the book of Esther? Well, what we need to first note is kind of where it fits in with history. So we need to realize that many years before the story of Esther begins, the Jews had gone to war, and their nation landed up being divided into the northern kingdom and to the southern kingdom. God judged the people of the northern kingdom, known as Israel, because of their stubborn unfaithfulness, and he sent the armies of Assyria against them. So as a result, the Jews of the northern kingdom had gone into bondage. 100 years later, God brought a similar judgment against the Jews in the southern kingdom, known as Judah, because of their disobedience. King Nebuchadnezzar invaded and deported the king of the south into Babylon. And then 11 years later, Nebuchadnezzar returned with a victorious blow. He destroyed Jerusalem, and he carried most of the Jews into captivity. Babylon fell into the hands of the Medo-Persians, and King Xerxes became king of the Persian Empire. And so it's important to note that the book of Esther is a slice of history from the life of the Jews living in exile in Persia. And this we're going to pick up next week. So what is this story all about? Well, in chapter 1, verse 3 to 4, we're told that this very powerful king throws a banquet, and this banquet lasts 180 days, just trying to show his power, the vastness of his power and his control. He then calls his wife to show her off and to impress the crowds, but she wasn't going to come as a trophy. Chapter 1, verse 1 tells us that King Xerxes had control of 127 provinces, but here we're told he couldn't even control one woman. In verse 22, a decree then goes out that she can never appear before him again. Women are now to do as they are told by their husbands, and they are to avoid Queen Vashti's example. Then in chapter 2, verse 2, we find that the king is now in replacement mode. He's looking for someone who is beautiful and a virgin. And it just so happened, verse 7 tells us, that Mordecai, who had an orphan cousin that he adopted. And in verse 16, we're told that Esther comes before the king, King Xerxes, and she wins his favor, and he sets the royal crown on her head. We're also told in verse 19 that Mordecai just happens to be sitting at the king's gate, and he hears in verse 21 to 23 that there are two men who are plotting an assassination against the king. And because he shares his knowledge with some of the king's advisors, the king is spared his life and the two men are hung. In chapter 3, we meet Haman. He is full of himself. He decrees that everyone needs to bow down to him, and everyone does, except for Mordecai, the Jew. And this just enrages Haman. And so he looked for a way to destroy all the Jews. So basically you have a situation where he goes to King Xerxes in verse 13 of chapter 3, tells them that all because of one Jew, that all Jews are traitors and that they need to be gotten rid of. And so that stems from one Jew not bowing down to him and this egocentric prime minister, Haman. Why? We ask ourselves, why does he react this way? Well, all we're told is in chapter 3, verse 1, that Haman is an Agagite. And what we know about that is that the Agagites are one of Israel's greatest enemies. And so the Jews know the day is here, and they put on sackcloth and ashes. But then in chapter 4, verse 8, Mordecai manages to get a message to Esther, and he begs her to go into the king's presence and to plead for her people, to tell him that she is a Jew. Up until now, she's kept this from him. But we're told in chapter 4, verse 11, that King Xerxes is not a king that you just go into the presence of. He hasn't called Esther. And therefore, verse 14 tells us, chapter 4, verse 14, Esther knows, it's actually not verse 14, verse 11, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that he be put to death. But Mordecai urges Esther to go in verse 14, and in verse 16, she is determined that she will go, even though this is going to come at possibly great personal cost to Esther. Then in chapter 5, verse 3, she goes to the king, and the king says, she says, I've got a request. She says, absolutely, I'm prepared to give you half of my provinces, to which Esther says, actually, what I'd really like is for you and for Haman to come for dinner. And when they come for dinner, she then says to them, actually, the reason I've had you for dinner is because I would like to invite you to a banquet. Haman thinks, of course, that this banquet that she's going to throw is for him. But we're told that he leaves in verse 9, and then again in verse 13 that he leaves, and everyone is bowing down to him, but he notices that he passes Mordecai, who does not bow down to him. And he gets home, and his wife doesn't even have to say to him, how was your day? He is enraged. And so in chapter 5, verse 14, his wife and his friends say, why don't you build a gallows and you can organize to have Haman hung from it? Lovely lady that he's married to. Well, Haman then starts to just picture all of this. He anticipates the day that he's going to have a gallows built, Mordecai being hung. What a great day this is going to be. But in chapter 6, we come to a turning point. In verse 1, we're told that the king cannot sleep. In verse 3, he then calls and he asks for the chronicles of his reign to be read to him. I guess he was hoping that this would put him to sleep. Doesn't say much about his reign. But as these chronicles are read, he is reminded of the man who spared his life. And he asks them, what was done for this man that spared my life? And he realizes that nothing had been done for him. It's at this moment that Haman then enters in verse 6 of chapter 6, and he is so egocentric that he thinks that the king is talking about him. But verse 10, it turns out, is that he's talking about Mordecai. And the one that, and this is the one that Haman was looking so forward to seeing hung. And he says, go at once, the king commanded him, and get the robe and the horse and do just as you've suggested for Mordecai, the Jew. Then in chapter 7, they head off to the queen's place for dinner. And in chapter 3, she pleads with the king for her life and for the life of her fellow Jews because of this decree that has gone out that all the Jews are destroyed. So the king then says in verse 6, well, who has put out this decree? Who has done this? And Haman is revealed. He then leaves completely enraged, and when he comes back in verse 8, it just so happens that he finds Haman lying with the queen on the couch. And so he says, what should I do with this man? And one of the eunuchs starts to tell him of these big gallows that have been built. And so in verse 10, Haman is hung on his own gallows. In chapter 9, verse 1 to 2, a new decree is made in favor of the Jews. And we're told in verse 18 that the Jews feasted. Well, how do we make sense of all of this? I wonder if you noticed that as we've gone through this, I did mention it before, that in the book of Esther, God is not named, not once. And yet his hand is the most influential hand on every page. But his hand is a hidden hand. He's never acknowledged by any of the characters. And I don't know if you noticed in chapter 10, verse 3, how it ends. Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews, and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews, because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews. I wonder if you have picked up the coincidence after coincidence after coincidence as we've gone through this book. Did you notice how Mordecai just happened to be at the court when the king was looking for a new queen? And it just so happened that he had this young cousin who was beautiful in form and feature. Just so happened that Esther wins the favor of the eunuchs and she takes their advice in chapter 2, verse 15. It just so happens that Mordecai overhears the plot to murder the king and goes unrewarded at the time. It just so happened that King Xerxes couldn't sleep and asks for the records and is given the account of how he escaped the assassination, and that no reward was given at the time to the man that spared his life. It just so happened that Haman was at the court and was just in time to tell the king what should happen to the man who delights in him. It just so happened that Esther did not make her request at the first dinner that she invited the king to, but rather at the second banquet, after the gallows had been built and after King Xerxes had had a sleepless night and had determined to honor Mordecai. It just so happened that Haman is on the sofa just at the moment that the king re-enters the room, that he's on that couch with the queen. Coincidence after coincidence. But is it? Perhaps rather what we are seeing is the hidden hand of God. Chapter 6, verse 13. Haman, his advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is a Jew of origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin. We see God humbling the self-exalted human and lifting up God's humble people. Coincidence? Absolutely not. I guess the question we need to be asking ourselves is, why is this book of Esther? Why is this story in the Bible? What is it that we are supposed to take away from it? We know that in the Old Testament, God's hand of blessing is seen in political and military triumph. But in the New Testament, we see that all of that is a foreshadowing of the great spiritual victory in which God's enemies crucify his son. And it is at this moment whereby Christ defeats Satan's greatest weapon of death and brings about deliverance for his people. Coincidence? No. There was a hidden hand bringing about God's sovereign purpose, reconciling the world to himself through Christ. David Cook on Esther so helpfully states that we all learn easily in life that no one is able to be trusted absolutely. We trust some people more than others, but there's no one that we can trust absolutely, is there? Do you know why? Because in order for me to absolutely trust someone, I need to know that that person knows all things about all things. I need to know, secondly, that they have my good in mind and that they love me at their heart. And thirdly, I need to know that this person is able to control all the events in my life and in history. And so there's actually only one person worthy of my trust: God himself. The Lord is the Lord. In Proverbs chapter 21, verse 1, reads this: "The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. He directs it like a watercourse wherever he pleases. There is no wisdom or insight that can succeed the Lord." It is this great truth, ladies, that will carry you through the ups and downs of life. To know that God alone, the all-loving and all-powerful and all-knowing God, is worthy of your trust. I listened to a story by David Cook where he shares that he moved to a new place. He lives in Australia, and he arrived at this, one of the people that lived in his neighborhood was on a farm, and it was on a cotton farm. And as he arrived, this neighbor took him in and showed him around. I don't know much about farming, especially not cotton farming, but anyway, the cotton stood about this high. He then showed him the heads of grain. They were all ready for harvest. He was soon to make an absolute fortune. And David Cook tells the story that very night, there was this crazy storm that no one could have predicted that just swept through their town, and it just ripped this man's farm to shreds. Not only did it destroy his cotton and the heads of grain, but it actually, from the roots up, it destroyed absolutely everything. And he said he remembers the next day when the whole town went outside to go and see the effects of the storm. He said that there was hail the size of golf balls that just came flowing down, and they went outside to check their cars that were completely dented. And he came into contact with this man, and as he hadn't yet had an opportunity to look at the farm, he says that one of the farm workers came to the owner of the farm, and as they looked around at the devastation, the worker turned to this man and he said to him, "The Lord gives and the Lord takes away." And he spat on the ground and he turned to walk away. And the owner of that farm, who stood to lose absolutely everything, said to him, "No, you come back and you finish that verse." He said, "The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." I wonder if you can say that when you find yourself sitting in the doctor's surgery or going to work, knowing that you're probably not going to get the promotion that you so desperately need. As you struggle to face the challenges that life has thrown at you. As you wonder what the new interest rate is going to be. As you think about current affairs and the impact that this will have on your pension or your investments. As you look at your adolescent about to make a big decision which is going to change the course of his or her life. As your marriage is taking strain, as your friendships that keep disappointing. In all those situations, where are you going to trust? Look what wisdom says. The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. And in chapter 21, verse 30, it says, "There is no wisdom, no insight, no plan that can succeed against the Lord." Where do you trust? Are you trusting here? Have you offloaded your confidence on the only one who is trustworthy? Don't trust your friends, your spouse, your family, or your employer. Don't trust in the economy or the government. The only place that we can trust absolutely is in the God of the hidden hand, knowing that his hand springs from a heart of love. And if you don't trust there, where will you trust?